Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Kerstin and Kerstin Person Waye. It doesn't really need a presentation today because you are such an important person in this, in the sound environment research field here. But anyway, professor at occupational and
environmental medicine.
Environmental medicine. Okay.
Thank you. I don't think I can speak as fast as the trains, but let's see what we can do. The focus of this presentation today is actually, I wanted to talk about children's experience, their understanding and coping with the everyday sound. And I wanted to try and describe it from the child perspective, but also from the personnel perspective. And in doing so, we have used qualitative analysis, also tried to combine it a bit with quantitative analysis. But I also wanted to connect it to the discussion of possible health implications of being in a preschool environment. And I'm going to give quite a large overview of what we've done for several years now, so I hope it's not going to be too fragmented for you. The question that we ask is, are young children at particular risk for adverse noise effects? And it's to connect with what Irene talked about, whether young children are especially vulnerable, and are they vulnerable because they cannot determine their sound environment at home and in the preschool? Are they vulnerable because they are in risk exposure situations, because they play very close to other children and with toys that emit high noise levels, for example? They also have been suggested that they have less capacities to anticipate, understand, and cope with their sound exposure and stressors in generally, and they are also in a crucial and sensitive phase of development. And this together could affect their future behavior, inclusive coping strategies, and also cognition and health. So in order to gain more knowledge into this, to get deeper understanding of this, we carried out focus groups interviews. And the main questions we had was what type of noise they heard, are there noises that they liked, what they did when they heard these sounds, and how they felt when they heard these sounds. And these are qualitative studies that were done some years ago, so some of you have already heard them, so I will go through them quite quickly. But what we did, we used the grounded theory analysis, and we carried out focus groups interviews to saturate categories until we got no more information if we had continued asking these children. And we strategically selected 5 preschools, and in total we ended up with 36 preschool children between the age of 4 to 6 years old. And the interview, I should say, were carried out by a special child pedagogue. So some of the outcomes that we got was their feeling when they heard sounds that they described as disliked. These feelings were very often described physically and emotionally painful, or they were very physically and emotionally experienced. And some of the experience are described in this figure here. And I will just go through it, and I will just give you this very briefly. And they also described various strategies that they used, or what they did when they heard these sounds. So they adopted both the active coping strategies, as we would say as adults, and passive. Sometimes they didn't know what to do. What was very sort of important in these focus groups interviews, what we learned was their comprehensibility of their sound environment. So some sounds were unknown, both in meaning and in origins, like the sounds from the radiator. What were they? That led to some frustration for the children. Some sounds were painful, like high screams. Some sounds were frightening, like when some children were angry or very sad. And these kind of distressing, scary, unpleasant sounds, as I said, led to different avoidance or coping strategies. So in total, the model that we derived from the child perspective was living with own uncontrollability of sounds and noise. It's a difficult word. So in short, the perceived comprehensibility, trustfulness, sound descriptions, and manageability of sounds were in the model interpreted as an expression of uncontrollability. And the degree of uncontrollability accounted for whether the children perceived the sounds as distressful or not. And as I said before, they tried to cope with these sounds in various ways, both this active and passive coping. So living with own uncontrollability of sounds and noise, that was how the model that we derived from the child's perspective. So if we then go to the personnel perspective, and this, I should say, our ongoing analysis. And here we did an analysis of a really large sample that we had, about in total about 4,000 preschool teachers. And we've just analyzed one question in a larger questionnaire. The question was, do you find that preschool noise affects the behavior of the children? So that could be both positive and negative, of course. And the answers, the distribution of the answers, were from not at all, somewhat, rather much, and very much. And we can see that there is a very large number of preschool teachers that find that preschool noise affect the children's behavior in one way or another. They also gave free comments on these responses, and these comments are then given about nearly 4,000 preschool teachers. So in order to deal with this in a sort of doable way, we did coding of the answers using a software called Open Code that's been developed in Umeå, at Umeå University. So initially, hello, there you are. Initially, we did like a manifest coding, so just looking what was said, what kind of words could you find, what, reading through all these 4,000 responses, what words kept appearing in these sentences, to try and find commonalities between the words. So you can see that some of them, the top one here, they described loud is given by the large dominance of answers. Voice, scream, to be heard, to drown other voices, and so on. But also unfocus, unconcentration, stress was very common. And this kind of wording, like many, noisy, disordered, followed by worry, anxiety, but also then conflict, fight, acting out, angry, and then finally slow down, go away, be quiet, leave alone, be left alone, and tiredness. So secondary analysis were done trying to find the latent meaning of these kind of wordings, which could be like vocal dominance, to be heard, unfocused chaos, crowding, insecurity, conflicts, withdrawal, exhausted. And if we see how these are distributed over these 4,000 answers, we can see that there's a large number of sentences that include the to be heard. So when there are high noise levels at preschool, what do children do? They try to be heard. But it also leads to unfocuses, out of control actions, and smaller insecurity, crowding, conflict, and so on, withdrawal. As a third step, we also did a synthesis 3, but this, as I said, is ongoing, trying to further understand what could be behind these wordings. So this is something I really invite anyone who are interested to take part in, because it's very interesting and it's quite complicated, and there are lots of different ways we could analyze this further. But one of the patterns that seem to emerge is when there are lots of noise, as you said, maybe the children are trying to take control, regain control, either by increasing their voice or by having some conflicts, or maybe avoidance. They are reacting to this chaotic environment either by going outwards or introvert. Maybe it's also some part here includes avoidance, or maybe a need for restoration. This is the type of thoughts that these data there are thoughts that we start thinking when we read the data. Because this can be analyzed in many different ways, and one of the way I just did for this presentation was to see can we find factors in our questionnaire that explains whether or not the personnel think that the behaviors are affected by noise or not. So we did a logistic regression, the binary outcomes, affected or not affected by noise. So, and the first part here are expressions that are given by the personnel that you could say is a expression of exposure. So for the first questionnaire, is the sound level so loud that you have difficulties hearing what other people say? So if we look at that as an exposure variable, which is, of course, it is for these people, we can see that in the adjusted analysis, it seems to be an increased risk of that the personnel say that the children are affected by noise if there is a bit more difficulties hearing what other people say. I should say that the crude analysis is just one factor included, but the adjusted is all the other variables included in the analysis. The other exposure variable that we have here, how often are you exposed to sound level so loud that you must raise your voice to be heard, which is around 75, maybe 70, something like that. So it's also an exposure-related variable. So here you can see quite clearly that with increasing exposure, it is also an increased, you could say, odds or risk that children are affected, their behavior is affected in a way. So it seems to be exposure-related from these analyses. We also see that annoyance does contribute a bit when you are very extremely annoyed, and also age group has an effect. So the older the personnel, the more they tend to report that noise affects children's behavior. That could be interpreted in many ways, of course, and we shouldn't really dwell on that now. We also looked at pedagogic. Would it be less or higher risk if you were in a Waldorf or Montessori and so on? Can't really say that the data allow for some certain conclusions here. Ur and skur, which is this outdoor environment, seem to lower the risk for the crude data, but we lose it, the statistic in the adjusted data. Age group, it seems to be a bit less risk if the age groups are between 1 and 5 compared to the younger ones or the older ones. So these are ongoing analysis, but in a way they give another story, but they do seem to connect also to the children's data. So if we go to health implications, how much time have I got left? 5? Okay, good. One of the things that we are, of course, concerned with this preschool setting are hearing disorders. And we have in our large because we have such high sound levels in the preschools, and especially for the children, but also for the personnel. And this larger study that I told you about was aimed to look at hearing disorders among preschool personnel. And we do see an increased risk of, sorry, this is in Swedish, but hearing impairment, difficulties perceiving speech, tinnitus, hyperacusis, and sound-induced auditory fatigue. The red bars are prevalence for preschool, and the green ones are for control. Women in generally working with different type of occupation. And these differences in prevalence rate, but also incidence rates, are significant, even when we adjust for different variables, including age, of course. So there is an increased risk for the personnel of developing hearing disorders. What about the children then? Well, children are exposed to significantly higher sound levels than compared to the personnel. If we look at these red bars, these are the equivalent noise levels. Sorry, these are equivalent noise levels when children are being indoors. The yellow ones are for the personnel. These are the maximum level. The black bars here are our guidelines, the limit values for adults that should not be exceeded to prevent hearing disorder. These are we derived from dosimeters that children wear during the day, and personnel, of course. But as I want to show here, the child is, of course, has a different constitution. The head is smaller, the shoulders are smaller, the ears are different as compared to an adult. They are at a lower level as compared to adults, so they are generally exposed to high sound levels, but they are also exposed to different types of sounds because of the head-related transfer functions. This has to do with reflexes of the shoulders and how the head affects the sound, and also the pinna, the outer ear. And in studies that were done in Germany, Janina Fels has shown that a small child's hearing is not as a small adult. So these would be this for 3,000 hertz as an adult or above 7 years of age. The frequency around 3,000 hertz is increased. So this is like a model of a head with the front and the left and the right side. So we can see with the red colors that the 3,000s are attenuated for or amplified, I should say, for an adult. But for a small child, especially for the babies, 6,000 is incredibly painful. But also for a preschool child, 6,000 is amplified. So this is a different sound that reaches the eardrum of a child. When we measure with a small head, like a child head and an adult head, we also see differences in the resulting frequency spectra. This is equivalent level in a playroom. This is an adult, amplified around 3,000, and this is a child amplified more than 4,000 anyway. I'm not really sure what the amplification is here. And this is for just a short-term measurement of a scream, where we see this amplification also higher up in frequency range for a child. This is also taken into account the volume of the ear canal that is shorter and narrower for small child, which again further amplifies 6,000 hertz. So then, of course, we are very interested in to see, is hearing affected at all on small children when they are in a preschool environment? So, of course, what we did was we measured DPOIE, which is a distortion product autoacoustic emission, which is a kind of measure of how the outer hair cells respond when we feed a signal. So it's like a passive method that can be used without the children having to respond. So it's quite a good method to use. It has been used as an indication for temporary threshold shifts before, and this is also how we use it here as an indication for temporarily reduced responsiveness of outer hair cells. That's how we think about it anyway. So this is in the morning when they come to preschool actually at the end of the week. So we see this is the level of the amplitude at 6 kilohertz. And here is in the afternoon, also in the end of the week. And if we have a lower value here, it indicates that we do also get a lower signal from the outer hair cell, indicating that the outer hair cells are less responsive. This is only 12 children, because the other 12 had some kind of ear inflammation, so then we can't do this. So we want, of course, to increase this data, and that's what we'll be doing now. I have one more figure. Is that too much? I can skip this. It has to do with health implications that children actually responding to the higher frequency sounds. But I think we'll skip that because of the time. So I will just conclude with saying, I would say that there are particular risks for noise effects because of these kind of factors here that they cannot determine, they cannot control. They have these kind of less capacities to cope and anticipate and so on. We can also see that they are exposed to very high noise levels and that there are tendencies that their hearing and also well-being are being affected by these sounds. Whether this affects their future behavior, including how their coping strategies are developed and their health are developed, we don't know. But of course, this is incredibly important to find out. This is part of the Sound Environment Research Unit. There are 3 people here missing, and of course we all contribute with this research. And then I want to finish with thank you for listening, and please, if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Kerstin. We will take questions now, I think 1 or 2. Who wants to have a question here? I will ask one while they are thinking. Some of this was actually very new for me also. I haven't heard you talk about this before. I'm thinking about this implication that children have their more sensitive hearing at other frequencies, or it's amplified by their morphological reasons. How could you describe that in words? How do children hear different than we do, if you just describe it in words?
Well, one of the things that I skipped here was the reaction to scraping, screeching sounds, like, you know, the cutlery on a plate, that type, or when you pull a chair over a floor, that kind of screeching sounds. They hate it. So they immediately cover their ears. This kind of high frequency, like, the blackboard, the chalk over the blackboard, those type of sounds are amplified and perceived really painful by the children. So when we do interventions, that's where we also need to really pay attention to reduce those sounds.
Very interesting. I think I'm still a young child then, because I also react to those noises. But it's even worse for them, I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is some advice for you who try to make a nice environment for people and for children especially. Do we have more questions? Well, thank you then, Kerstin.